You know who has access? You know who has access to a 9800 X3D before it's launched and officially announced to the public? That would be board manufacturers like MSI, which is why it's really interesting that we now have slides published by MSI featuring the 9000 X3D parts in gaming as well as Cinebench, and not just the 8-core part that we would probably call the 9800 X3D, although they're just calling the 9000 X3D 8-core part, but we also have the 16-core part. So this is pretty interesting, but should we trust these slides? What are they? Well, first of all, again, let's just, where is this coming from? So apparently at Hardware Luxx, they had a MSI factory tour, and they published an article that is almost entirely just a photo dump of stuff they saw while they were there. Well, it looks like they must have also been taking photos of some embargoed information, and then I think it would have been just a mistake where they dumped their entire photo album from that factory tour, or at least if they were filtering things, they missed these slides. Now, I'm on Hardware Luxx now and no longer see these slides as part of the photo dump, so it seems like they have removed them now. But that didn't stop places like videocards.com and other sites from getting screenshots of these leaked slides before they were taken down by Hardware Luxx. So this gets us some really interesting numbers. However, before we dig any further into them, look at what's on the bottom of some of these slides, but not all of them. It says, first of all, credit to the MSI OC lab, so that's who's doing the testing. Tested with 9000 X3D PC samples, performance is expected to be better on PR samples and retail chips, meaning these are likely some kind of earlier production sample, not the final retail sample that will be sent to reviewers and that you would buy, indicating that if there is a performance difference, and they're saying it is expected to be different and better on the final retail chips. So one way to look at that is that this would maybe be a worst case scenario if the retail chips aren't any better than what they got as their test samples here. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, we can talk about these Cinebench numbers in a minute, but I think it's gonna be more interesting to jump into these gaming performance numbers. And also it's very important to think about what you're looking at here more carefully than just saying, oh, it's only a 2% performance gain. More on that in a second. So first of all, what do we see here? So this is the slide talking about the 8-core Ryzen 9000 X3D part in orange up against the 7800 X3D, so the previous 8-core X3D part from the previous generation and currently the fastest gaming CPU. That's in blue. We only have 3 games available at this point. We have Far Cry 6, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and Black Myth Wukong. Now, I'm fairly certain that what they're using here is built-in benchmarks. And the thing about built-in benchmarks is sometimes they're not great for CPU testing because often they're not showing CPU-limited sections of the game, which is what I think is happening here. For example, let's talk about Black Myth Wukong for a second, where they're getting 62 FPS instead of 61 FPS compared to the previous generation. You might be like, wow, that is not a great uplift. Well, they're testing on an RTX 4090 at 1080p. By the way, they are on Windows 11 24H2, which I believe includes those updates that should have better performance for Ryzen CPUs and things like that. So anyway, that does appear to be the case. Now, what am I talking about here? Notice it's an RTX 4090 at 1080p, and yet their performance is only hitting about 60 FPS. How could that be possible? Well, it's possible because, well, let me actually show you my testing of the Black Myth Wukong benchmark. Now, this was performed when it was prior to release, meaning the game has been patched and there are different drivers. What I'm trying to show you here is they're probably using the game's full RT mode. This is the game's full RT mode on an RTX 4090, and notice I'm averaging 66 FPS in the benchmark. Now, I'm not trying to say that you should compare my score to their score because there's differences underlying, like I said, it could be a different version of the game, all of that. But what I'm saying is that the version of the game that runs at around 60 FPS on an RTX 4090 isn't CPU limited. So let me actually show you the footage here. So this is running on the RTX 4090 on my 7800X3D platform. So this is my testing, to be clear. This is not MSI's testing. And what you can notice here is the GPU utilization is staying around 99%. What that indicates is that we are not CPU limited. Now, I did a video yesterday talking about people misunderstanding when you are CPU limited versus GPU limited, and honestly, I need to do a follow-up video to that because there were so many comments that are pushing back against what I was saying, but I don't need to get into that here. We'll talk in an upcoming video. Well, the important thing to identify here is that if we are hitting 99% GPU utilization, then we are at least mostly GPU limited, meaning that putting in a faster CPU will not likely affect the performance very much. Meaning that if you're using this test to measure a CPU's performance uplift, you're not likely to see it because we are GPU limited. Now, I also want to be clear that I don't for sure know what settings they're using here. I'm just saying that all three of these games feature a built-in benchmark, which makes it very easy to get side-by-side runs that are mostly identical. And so it would be very likely that that's what they're using here, is the built-in benchmark. And these are likely the settings that they're using despite them not being published. All we know is that they were at 1080p, but these are the settings that make sense for a 4090 to only be producing around 60 FPS at 1080p. For example, if I go to the 1080p cinematic mode on my 4090, I'm hitting closer to 89 FPS on the RTX 4090. So those are unlikely to be the settings that they're using. By the way, this game is still not a particularly CPU-limited game, even if you're not using the ray tracing. By the way, ray tracing does have a large CPU overhead in a lot of games for computing the BVH structure. So it does make sense at times to use ray tracing to measure CPU performance. But here, again, even in the cinematic mode, we're showing GPU utilization around 99%. So if there's CPU bottlenecks happening here, it's not much, right? So even if the CPU was 20% faster, putting in a 20% faster CPU would not get you 20% better performance, because in this case, it's the GPU that's limiting the frame rate from increasing, at least primarily. Not saying you can't get some benefits to 1% lows, especially with Unreal Engine 5. Sometimes when you load in a new area, there's going to be some stutter that's worse on the lower end CPUs and affects 1% lows and all sorts of things. But the long story short is it's likely that they were in a GPU limited situation for this Black Myth Wukong testing, because Black Myth Wukong tends to be a GPU bound game, even at low resolutions on a 4090, especially if you're using the heavy ray tracing settings. So that's my thoughts on that. Now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Again, a game with a built-in benchmark that is not particularly CPU demanding. The built-in benchmark for Shadow of the Tomb Raider runs through, I think, 3 different sections of the game. You get a little interior scene, then you get a jungle scene, and then you get a city area, or town area. The town area of the benchmark can be CPU limited, but the other sections are not often CPU limited. So if this is representative of the full built-in benchmark run, then again, it wouldn't show the full CPU uplift because at times you would be GPU limited rather than CPU limited due to the part of the game that's being tested. That's why, for example, I know when Hardware Unboxed does their CPU testing, they intentionally do not use the built-in benchmark for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. They manually run around one of the town areas, which actually can be heavily CPU limited. Now, again, they're not saying if this was a town area or if this was the built-in benchmark. So again, I'm having to read a bit into this and say it's probably the built-in benchmark, but I can't prove that to you for sure. Now, Far Cry 6 also has a built-in benchmark, and that built-in benchmark can sometimes be, again, not the greatest way to test CPU-limited situations. However, this one's showing a 13% performance gain, so that's at least a bit more interesting. So after all of this, I'm going to basically say it's interesting to see this. However, due to all of the things I brought up, it's also possible that a larger sample of games tested more carefully in CPU-limited environments for third-party reviews could probably show different results. So I wouldn't lean too far into these numbers. However, it is interesting to see it and to see one that's as high as a 13% uplift. So interesting to see there. Now, if I switch slides, we are now on the 16-core parts. This is now the 16-core Ryzen 9000 X3D in orange, and the blue is the 16-core X3D part from the 7000 series. So the blue is now not the 7800 X3D, it's the 7950 X3D. And the orange is now the part that we would probably call the 9950 X3D, unless AMD chooses to change their naming scheme. Here, once again, notice that we're getting exactly the same frame rate numbers in Black Myth Wukong, 61 and 62, and that's only showing, again, that 2% performance uplift. Now, Shadow of the Tomb Raider is showing a 4% uplift. If I switch back to the other slide, notice that the blue number is actually lower on the 16-core part. Actually, both numbers are lower on the 16-core part. So this is showing that sometimes the 16-core parts are actually slower in games than the 8-core parts, and we're seeing that here, explaining some of the different numbers. Anyway, but again, only showing that 4% uplift. But again, what part of the game are they testing? If it's the built-in benchmark run, like I said, only parts of it are actually CPU limited generally. And then in Far Cry 6, we're at 160 versus 178, which is showing an 11% uplift. Again, if I scroll back to the 8-core part, we were going 168 to 190, showing a 13% uplift. Now, another thing I want to note here, again, actually, if we scroll back here, is this is very much showing that the 8-core 9000X3D part, at least based on the samples that MSI has, do seem to still have better gaming performance than the 16-core parts. Some people were speculating that that might be solved or not be the case with the 9000X3D. But if we compare the numbers here, it's 190 FPS on the 8-core part in Far Cry 6 and 178 FPS on the 16-core part. Again, if we look at the Shadow of the Tomb Raider results, the 16-core part is at 285, and the 8-core part is at 295. So again, the 8-core part is faster, and Black Myth Wukong is showing 62 on both, once again indicating that it's just not a CPU-limited test, so it's fairly irrelevant for showing us the performance differences between CPUs. Anyway, so that's my thoughts on the gaming tests. Now let's go ahead and jump into the Cinebench scores. So for Cinebench scores here, on this side, we have the 16-core parts, and on this side, we have the 8-core parts. Now, first of all, we need to look very carefully at what this is testing, okay? So, so again, 16 cores on this side, and this is showing single core, this is showing multi-core, and what they're showing is basically parity. Parity to what? Notice that they are no longer in blue comparing against the previous generation X3D parts. They're showing performance up against the current 9000 series non-X3D parts. So to be clear, the blue numbers in these graphs are not the same parts that were the blue numbers in the gaming tests, okay? So the blue numbers are now the 9000 series non-3D parts. What this slide is showing is that the 3D Vcache parts aren't slower, or at least aren't slower in a meaningful way compared to the non-3D Vcache parts from the same generation. Now, for those of you kind of out of the loop on why you might suspect the 3D Vcache parts to be slower in heavily multi-core dependent parts that aren't cache sensitive, well, it's that the 3D Vcache parts are generally fast at gaming because gaming often benefits greatly from increased cache size, which is what the 3D parts are doing, is they're adding in 3D Vcache. Now, the non-3D parts, well, let me put it this way. In certain tests like Cinebench, you don't really benefit from the cache, and the cache is hard to cool, or at least it has been on the 7000 series parts and the 5000 series 3D parts, which means that generally they are clocked lower than their non-3D cache counterparts. So that being the case, sometimes the 7800X3D will be faster in gaming than the 7700 non-X3D, but will be, it's faster in gaming but slower due to lower clock speeds in productivity tests that are not Vcache sensitive. So here what they're showing is there's not a lot of performance loss. You're at basic parity for the 16-core parts. And actually on the 8-core parts, they're interestingly showing a loss of 2% in single core, but actually a gain of 6.5% in multi-core when compared with the 9700X non-3D Vcache part, which is kind of interesting. But they're basically, their conclusion is headlined with performance is close. So in other words, they're saying you don't really lose meaningful performance numbers with the going with the 3D parts instead of the non-3D parts when looking at Cinebench at least. Now, they have another Cinebench slide here, and it's important to understand what is different about this one. What they're saying here, in the previous slide, I think they were just letting them run as they want to run. In this slide, we're looking at they are locking the cores at 5.2 gigahertz. So what they're showing is that, and again, it's the non-3D Vcache parts versus the 3D Vcache parts. That's what we're seeing here. So what they are doing, again, 8-core and 16-core. What they're showing is that if you lock the non-3D parts and the 3D parts at the same frequency, in this case 5.2 gigahertz, performance is within margin of error. You're seeing, 0.3% slower, 0.2% higher. It's basically within margin of error, so that what they're trying to show is that if the cores do run at the same frequency, there's no meaningful performance difference in Cinebench. And Cinebench being representative of a, thread-heavy task that's not Vcache sensitive, if that kind of makes sense. All right, we do have one more slide here, which is the Cinebench numbers again, not gaming numbers, for the 7000 series X3D parts up against the 9000 series X3D parts. On the left-hand side, it's 16-core versus 16-core, so the 7950 X3D in blue, and the probably what will be called the 9950 X3D in orange. Here, interestingly, they are showing meaningful productivity performance gains, or at least Cinebench, as however representative that is, overall, performance gains. They're showing a 9% single core gain for our 16-core X3D part generationally, and a 16% performance gain for the, again, 16-core versus 16-core generational uplift when comparing 3D Vcache parts. Also, then if we look at the 8-core parts, they're showing actually kind of a massive difference here. I actually want to zoom in on this. This is pretty impressive if this ends up being accurate. Here we're seeing the 8-core part show an 18% single core performance gain over the 7800X3D and a 28% multi-core performance gain over the 7800X3D. So perhaps, again, like I was saying, with the previous generation parts maybe being more frequency limited compared to the non-3D Vcache parts, maybe the 9000 series isn't as, slowed down by that or something. But anyway, this does show potentially some big generational uplifts here. But again, why weren't we seeing, if it's 18% faster in single core, sorry, I slid that out of the way. If it's 18% faster in single core, why aren't we seeing those gaming numbers? And that's why I was so careful to point out that these gaming tests are potentially misleading if they're actually GPU limited rather than CPU limited built-in benchmarks. So anyway, overall thoughts on this is that this is interesting, but like I said, this is pretty limited testing. It's also, as I mentioned at the beginning, and pretty important to note, that this is also on early PC samples, and again, they're expecting retail chips to be faster. So that's interesting. But anyway, this is not final numbers. It'll be cool to see the reviews when they come out. But I would also say that while we've had rumors that these parts are coming out soon, the fact that we're starting to get leaked information tests like this is just further evidence that these parts probably are coming out soon. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, let me know what you guys think about all this in the comment section, and expect a follow-up video soon to my last video talking about CPU bottlenecks. because there were so many comments in that I think are either misunderstanding what I said or were asking questions like, how can you be CPU bottlenecked when it's showing 50% CPU utilization? There's a whole, and like, what's the difference between being game optimization bottlenecked versus being CPU bottlenecked? I have a lot more thoughts to share, but that, like I said, that's for a future video. I'll probably post it today for channel members, but give this video 24 hours to breathe, so probably up on the main channel tomorrow, unless there's another big news story or something. But anyway, that's a reminder that if you hit the join button down below to become a channel member, sometimes you do get early access to some videos, not because I'm trying to paywall them, but because sometimes you can't post videos too close to each other on the main feed for the YouTube algorithm. There's some other benefits you could check out. Huge thank you for everybody who has, but also huge thank you to just viewers, subscribers, commenters. You're all beautiful people, and I hope you have an excellent day.